we received our first very large grant from a big funder that was only excited about one part of our program. And ultimately, we did decide to take the grant. And it was really challenging because what it felt like at the time was an aggressive takeover of our business, And I think about that moment a lot where we were hugely excited about the funding, but we basically had no power. The only power we had was to say, no, thank you, and stay really small. The other option was to say, let's let the funder decide our strategy, our growth plan for the next 5 years.
We can't fix the world alone, but collaborating isn't easy, and systems are allergic to change. So how do we do it without losing our damn minds?
That's what we're here to find out.
I'm English Saul.
I'm Jeff Walker. Welcome to System Catalyst, the podcast that cracks the code for making the world a better place.
If you've ever looked for funding, you might be frustrated by how difficult it is to get people to believe in the very important work that you do. And even if you do get someone to invest in your organization, they might come in only wanting to fund a small part of your work, or with a series of conditions that are difficult to fulfill. It could even result in a nightmare decision. Either you change your mission and strategy, or you don't get the money. No wonder so many people in the sector are moving away from this and instead going for a trust-based approach. But trust doesn't come easy. As a donor myself, I know philanthropists are well-intentioned, but are often reluctant to hand out money without any requirements. But what if another experienced donor vouched for an organization? Or what if instead of putting all their eggs in one basket, they had the opportunity to fund a portfolio with several organizations working on an issue that they cared about? Would they be more willing to donate in an unrestricted way? That idea is called collaborative philanthropy. And our guest today, Matti Navellou, is going to tell us all about it. She is head of ICONIQ Impact, an organization that brings philanthropists together to co-fund systems change work. Today, you'll learn how impactful it can be to team up with others, whether you are a nonprofit leader looking for funding or someone who wants to donate in an intentional way. Matti, I'm so excited to do this interview. Tell me how you're doing. How's life right now?
Life is great. I have a wonderful team. We've got so many exciting projects going on, and it's a little bit of a sprint with all these big campaigns that we're trying to really get off the ground before year end on all sorts of topics, from women's health, reproductive health, mental health, and all really exciting.
I love that. Is there something, Matti, that like your team or people in general would be surprised to know about you or learn about you?
Gosh, probably a lot, I moved a lot growing up, probably went to 10 different schools before the age of 18.
Wow.
Come from many different cultures, first language being French. Spent a lot of time in the field at the start of my career in places like Burkina Faso, Uganda, Kenya. And I think most folks probably don't know that I started my career in public advocacy, poverty relief campaigning. And I think a lot of the tenets of that work are a really cool driver of our strategy at ICONIQ Impact, which is how do you leverage different players with different skills to really advance a social impact goal.
What got you into that kind of work, that work of advocacy? Why is that kind of the starting point for you?
Yeah, I think part of it was instilled in me just from a young age, from family, especially my mother. She and her family had to flee Egypt in 1956 during the Suez Crisis, where Jews were given like 3 days to leave Egypt.
Oh my gosh.
And so she was 1 year old when she left and became a refugee for the first 18 years of her life before she could become a British citizen. And so she always had this, very strong sense of justice and desire to support marginalized communities. So as a family, from a very young age, we would always volunteer locally in the countries we were living at the time and got to just experience the importance of leveraging your skills to help others.
One question I have is, you were on the grantee side kind of before coming into this role that you're in now. Is there something that you experienced that made you realize that like, oh, wow, we really need more of a trust-based system?
Absolutely. Gosh. And I remember this so well because my first job was through a initial small grant from DFID, the Department of International Development in the UK at the time, which was a small grant, but enabled us to like hire a couple people. And it felt like $1 million at the time. And so one, I remember how important even these small grants are, and they can literally change the lives of, young systems catalysts and be the kickstart that an incredible campaigning organization needs to get off the ground. And I also remember we received our first very large grant from a big funder that was only excited about one part of our program. Let's say we had 5 different components of our program. This funder in particular really just cared about one of them in a couple of regions. And so we had this debate as a team around, gosh, this is such a huge amount of funding. But what it would mean is suddenly we'd have a very lopsided team where, just 1/5 of our program is funded at a really large scale and the rest is not. And ultimately, we did decide to take the grant. And it was really challenging because what it felt like at the time was an aggressive takeover of our business. It was a funder saying, I kind of want you to do this and I'm going to fund it. And we like you as a team. But suddenly, 80% of the team is working on just one area. So it didn't feel great. And I think about that moment a lot where we were hugely excited about the funding, but basically had no power. The only power we had was to say, no, thank you, and stay really small. The other option was to say, let's let the funder decide our strategy, our growth plan for the next 5 years. So it was a really, really interesting experience on the nonprofit side. And I never want to do that to an organization because if you're not working on that team, who are you to decide where they should focus, right? So I'm thrilled that all of the funding we do with ICONIQ Impact is unrestricted funding. And we trust the leaders who are closest to the work to decide how to spend the funds and when.
Wow, that's a really powerful story. And I feel like it's one that I've heard similarly before with other grantees, right? It really isn't, the greatest thing when I think that a lot of programs are funder dictated. A lot of people all the time, we all throw around this idea of collaboration. And I wonder if you have a story that really kind of highlights some of the work that ICONIQ has done that really puts systems change and system catalyst front and center.
I love that. And I'm happy to share an example, actually, one of our first collaborative efforts, which was a beautiful refugee resettlement award led by Chris Larson and his wife, Lena Lamb. And we did this in partnership with Lever for Change. As you know, we love partnerships, and they're a wonderful partner of ours. And this was a global RFP process where we solicited hundreds of applications from all around the world for the best groups that were focused on refugee resettlement in particular. And one of the groups that ended up winning was a fully refugee-led coalition, which made us so happy for lots of reasons. I mean, the first thing that happened during COVID is that all the foreign nonprofit leaders left, because it wasn't safe. And the only folks left on the ground in refugee camps were refugees themselves. And yet so little funding in the refugee space flows directly to refugee-led groups. And so we were able to award a $10 million award to this incredible coalition of purely refugee-led groups. And what we did, and this was in my first year at ICONIQ, is we hosted a wonderful call. We ended up with, I think, about 40 people on the call, funders who've never funded this space. And within an hour, we raised $24 million just from a Zoom. And it wasn't something we expected, but it was a testament to the process and then how compelling these groups were and the power of simply having, incredible peers spending that time together on a call to listen and be inspired. And again, most of the money was from folks who've never funded in the refugee space before. And so that was really inspiring and actually was a catalyst for us to create the collab model to say, hey, you can have people who are willing to co-fund together to move faster. And one of the things we love the most about our model and where we're at today is that of that 600 million number that I mentioned, of grants out the door, 70% of that is through co-funding. So it's through folks who, just said, I'm happy to just co-fund with this person. This strategy makes sense. Like, I'm not going to have to build it myself, but I'm happy to jump on. And that's really powerful. And I don't think happens enough in philanthropy.
Let me tell you a bit more about this collab model, because it's just brilliant. Basically, ICONIQ bundles organizations working on a particular area, say climate equity or education, and connect donors who are interested in co-funding that issue. They then bring in experts and leaders from impacted communities so everyone can collaborate on the solutions.
I'll use the example maybe of our ocean collaborative, which came out really beautifully out of just many conversations with different funders who said, we all want to work on climate mitigation and we want to do it at scale and we don't know where to start. And so the first thing we did is we got them in a room together alongside, some of the leading climate experts we know. And we said, and I know you'll like this because you're a data person, we said, let's see what the data shows. And one of the areas that bubbled up is the ocean climate space, like huge potential. And the numbers like, the ocean can actually achieve 35% of the emissions needed to address climate change, but it receives less than 7% of climate funding. So it's this beautiful area where philanthropy can actually catalyze change in a dramatic way. Ultimately, the group ended up saying, that's fantastic, we're excited, let's do this together. And so what we did is we were really thoughtful around who to partner with, both the experts on the topic, but then who are the grantees that we ended up bringing to the table as part of a 6-month learning process. And so over 6 months, we had a group of about 10 philanthropists joining calls together. And on every call, we would have a learning component where they would learn either from a funder that has leadership in this space for years and years, or a organizational expert in whether it was blue carbon or ocean sequestration. And so they would both learn more about the space at each time, but then be able to input based on the learning where they wanted to focus in as a group. And so it was a true co-created process, but informed by the data. And so what was really fun is that the learning brought together by, our convening power in the space led to informed co-creation of a collaborative. There's now a $50 million collaborative funding all these groups. And now some of those relationships have turned into completely new programs that have nothing to do with ICONIQ Impact, but were catalyzed by that learning and bringing a really disparate community together that, but for ICONIQ Impact, probably would have never met.
Do you find that in these moments, have you gotten positive feedback from kind of all sides and all stakeholders in that equation to say, yeah, this worked?
The short answer is yes. We have received really positive feedback, both from the donors to say, this roadmap was helpful. I was able to connect with other peers. I was able to meet experts. I was able to sign off on criteria and a strategy that makes sense to me. And then the best part about this model, the collaborative fund model, is that we actually are able to support about 20 grantees per portfolio in a way where they just report into one entity. They don't have to report into 10 different donors, asking them for different things and different measurements. We're very proud to espouse a trust-based philanthropy approach, which, by the way, is really rigorous despite being called trust-based. But we don't tell them exactly what we want to see and that they have to meet these measurements. We ask them what success will look like over the 3 years. And then we check in. We'll check in verbally every quarter. We will do an annual report and we will report on the progress. But the power dynamic has shifted where it's they're telling us what success looks like and we're checking in and we're seeing how we can support. But when, historic grant making, especially with some of the larger institutional foundations, there was a period of time where it was very much, we want to see these results. Can you move the needle on X, Y, Z? And that's all we're interested in, rather than actually starting with the question of, you're an incredible leader in your industry. You tell us what success looks like for you, and let's follow your journey and let's be a good partner. And by the way, if you encounter challenges and stumbling blocks along the way, which of course you will, every social entrepreneur does, let us know how we can help. Right? Beyond the check. We're not just a checkbook and we don't want to be just a checkbook. And so that's part of the different relationship we look to build with our grantee cohorts.
I think that that's really good. And I think that, I can imagine, at least based on a lot of the folks that I've worked with who are really out there kind of on the front lines doing the work, having that safe space to make a mistake or to stumble and know that like, oh, I'm not going to just pull the funding, or I'm not going to, berate you for, using money here, or using money there. I think it's really desired. I think that that's really what people are looking for is a safe space to say, I'm trying to solve a complex problem and I want a team. I want partnership in that. So I think that's really wonderful. So Matti, you now are in a position where you work with various different types of capital. You work with a lot of different donors. And so tell me about how these stories of systems change comes out in these conversations when trying to move this capital and talking to these donors and trying to solve complex problems and really trying to move the needle in system change.
Someone shared this quote with me when I started working in philanthropy, and they said, when you've met one philanthropist, you've met one philanthropist, which is a funny quote, but it stayed with me because what it really means is that no individual philanthropist is the same. They all have such a different way of seeing the world, are coming from different backgrounds, have a different propensity to risk and all that. And what that means is that you have to adapt your approach to the person. You start by being a much better listener than you are a talker and really trying to understand where folks are coming from. And then based on that, you can say, okay, maybe what's going to be most helpful for this philanthropist is actually sitting down for 3 hours with someone who has been in a similar place to them, but 3 years ago, and has been able to grow and develop their personal strategy as a philanthropist in the last 3 years through time with experts or hiring a couple of people. And maybe that's going to be what is going to help catalyze action for them. Maybe for someone else, they need to spend time in the field and really understand a system in much more depth. Maybe for someone else, they just never had that spark of inspiration. And so how can we create an opportunity for that? But I wish that there was a one size fits all approach, but there just isn't. And I think just starting by listening, you'll find, and this again comes from my campaigning background, is that, most people, I would argue, the vast majority of people do want to help. And the reason they don't move to action is because they don't know how, and they don't know what that pathway is. And so often it's as simple as showing someone the pathway of the first 2 or 3 steps. And so we try and do that. And one of the ways we do that is, through making it really easy for philanthropists to collaborate.
That's interesting. It's so funny because I have heard that quote before, right? Like, if you've met one family office, you've met one family office. If you've met one philanthropist, you've met one. And it really is important to take an individualized approach. And I do wonder, and how do you think about that on the grantee side? Because to be honest, I've never heard somebody say, once you've met one grantee, you've met one grantee. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder, do we want to take that same approach on both sides? Or like, how do you guys think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the truth is every grantee is different. I think as you know so well, like the power imbalance between grantees and funders is so large that folks tend to focus in this space on like how to appeal to the funder community versus how to serve the grantee community and partner with them thoughtfully. We try to the best of our ability to append that. And we do it in a few ways, which is to really listen just as much to the grantee partners. And part of that includes things like language barriers, cultural barriers. How do we as a team adapt to that and make sure that we're not letting our own biases influence who we fund and why? And often that means spending more time and more work to actually find these more overlooked and underfunded groups, or more time listening and spending 2 hours on a call instead of 30 minutes because you need to adapt to it, to a certain culture. So we try and spend time on that too. And then one way to do that, given the amount that we fund, which is now upwards of $600 million, we also rely a lot on trusted partners, right? Who are the partners on the ground who've been funding in these spaces for a long time, where we can thoughtfully outsource some of this work, but make sure that we end up funding the right groups, because you're not going to be able to spend as much time with every single grantee when you're funding hundreds of different groups. But it's a great point to raise.
No, and I mean, I think that from what I know about you and what I know about your work and ICONIQ, and it feels like where you all really fit and what the purpose that you serve is kind of this bridge between the capital and the places that the capital needs to go, right?
Right.
What's hard about that?
Well, I would say the first thing I'd say is that role is a joy and a privilege to be in that kind of intermediary role, because you get to meet just such incredible and smart leaders on both sides of that. And often I like to think of it as almost like a translating role, because you're translating not just the language, but the work, right? A lot of the philanthropists we partner with, they may only have become philanthropists a couple of years ago, right? It might be a recent IPO story. And so there's a lot of education that has to happen. And likewise, for a lot of the grantees that we end up supporting, they may not have experience on how to present in front of a donor community. More often than not, you'll see, you'll have an organization ask to set up a call, and then they'll spend the entire call running through a deck and a presentation rather than asking questions. And so there's like even really basic things like, why don't you start learning about this funder, asking questions so that you can adapt your approach? And so we try and do a lot of that education on both sides. Like, we educate our funders on how to show up and what to expect in these kind of conversations and try and facilitate that. But then we also try and educate our grantees in terms of what's going to be most effective in building really a true human-to-human relationship, because that's ultimately what's going to get the best results. And what you want in a grantee funder, partnership is a really long-term partnership and relationship. And that starts with building trust, and it starts with understanding where each other is coming from. So I think part of the challenge is you see a lot of funders not taking the time or not having the time to have those conversations. So what we try and do on the ICONIQ Impact side is create a process whereby we can accelerate the timeline on that and really broker that trust earlier on. And we do that through this collaborative fund model.
I love that. Okay, so next question. What would you say to the grantees that want to be in this ecosystem, that really want to leverage capital from solid partners, be in the sort of the trust-based relationship, and especially to those grantees that feel like they're outside of access to the family office space, to the big funding? Like, how do they kind of catapult themselves into this system?
Yeah. And it can be really tough, especially with no direct kind of strong relationships that have access. I would say the first is take time to understand what your ask is, right? I think a lot of nonprofits will maybe go after a big funder, but perhaps haven't really thought about what kind of funder they're looking for. And so doing the research on like exactly what type of funder you're looking for and understanding what they're looking for too will help equip you better with the right talking points and the right strategy to approach. I would also say simplify and customize, right? Don't send your 20-page deck to any funder because they will not read it. They may not even open it. And customize. The more personal, the better. Understand what makes them tick, what motivates them, and really adapt your messaging to that as well as your ask. But it really starts by kind of truly trying to understand your funder audience, which can be hard. Again, if you don't have direct access, a lot is not available online. But try and be really thoughtful around your engagement strategy and ask more questions. You don't want to be talking more than you're listening on those calls. You really want to learn as much as you can. If you have 30 minutes with a funder, listen to them. Don't spend it talking at them.
Wow, thanks for sharing that. So if you could wave a magic wand, what does the future of collaborative funding look like? What is it that you want to continue to work through and achieve at ICONIQ? And, how do we start to presence that emerging future?
Yeah. I mean, I talked a little bit about the trust-based approach. I hope more funders are open to, funding general ops, trusting the leaders to do the work and doing more long-term and unrestricted funding. And I also, really would encourage funders to move faster, move with urgency. There is so much money sitting on the sidelines, and often it's this fear of being the perfect philanthropist and making that one or perfect grant. There's no such thing as a perfect grant. Just get started. You'll learn so much through starting the process. It's much better to get started and help the field versus have this indecision that leads to no movement at all. And then on the collaboration side, it's worth noting that philanthropy as a sector is still dramatically underperforming as a sector. Typical grants are one time, they're reactive versus strategic. And so I would say build a strategy for your philanthropy, right? It sounds really simple, but everyone has a strategy for their investments. Most people don't have a strategy for their philanthropy. And if you don't want to build it, find someone smart who's willing to build it for you, or partner with a funder who is really excited for you to come in as co-funder and just learn alongside them. You don't even have to hire even one staff. You can just partner with others thoughtfully. And so I would say, if you really are just getting started, make 3 calls, 1 to a peer philanthropist, 1 to a leader in a space that you think you might be excited about, and then 1 to a trusted advisor, someone smart who's doing this work, who's willing to kind of translate this very odd space for you and can give you advice on the next steps to take. And by co-funding with someone else, you can just truly accelerate, not just accelerate the pace of your giving, but you get to leverage a really smart team that you don't have to manage. And so I would really think about this leverage angle. And for a lot of busy philanthropists, I think they are underestimating the leverage that they can have through partnership.
That's it for today's show. Please don't forget to subscribe to System Catalysts so you don't miss out on a new episode. Also, do us a huge favor by rating our podcast and leaving us a review. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we'll catch you all in the next episode. Before we go, we'd like to thank our producers at Hueman Group Media. We'd also like to thank our incredible network of partners who are supporting our mission: the Skoll Foundation, the Aspen Institute's Global Leadership Network, Echoing Green, DRK Foundation, Maverick Collective, Virgin Unite, Charlize Theron Africa Outreach Project, Boldly Go Philanthropy, Synergos, Forward Global, Nexus, and New Profit. If you are interested in becoming a System Catalyst and would like to learn more about our partners, please visit systemcatalysts.com.